Buenos dias, and unfortunately this is as far as my Spanish goes, so you have to bear with me speaking English. It's a great honor being here, actually, and thanks very much to Benjamin to organize this event. I'm actually really excited about this, being able to discuss some of the issues that is mostly related to my own research, but obviously also feeds very much into this special report on climate change and land. And in a sense, I will actually continue from what Benjamin has started to talk about before the break and focus very much on the biogeochemical aspects, whereas he's sort of spoken mostly about the biophysical aspects. So it's really, a very broad title, Impacts of Climate Change on Land and Vice Versa. And I thought I'd start a little bit with the basics and remind ourselves about the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere as it was in round about 1870, 288 ppm at that time. And in 2017, it had actually increased to 405 ppm. And you probably all are aware of that CO2 is, of course, one of the major greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So that's why we're here, in a sense. But if you actually look at it, how we actually got there. So these bars that you're seeing on this graph, they're an estimated total contribution of various activities to get us from 1870 to today. So for instance, emissions of coal contributed within those 150 years period or so, around about 94 ppm of atmospheric CO2 concentration. Oil, 72 ppm, gas, 31, cement, 5, and land use, mostly deforestation, around about 88 ppm. So this is the sort of, the cumulative, human-made emissions since 1870 to 2017. But as you can immediately see, if we're summing all these up, we're actually not ending up at 405 ppm. We're actually ending up at something like close to 600 ppm CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, if we only look at our human-made emissions. What's going on there? What's going on there is actually that both land and oceans, which you see here as green and blue bars, they're actually taking up CO2 from the atmosphere. They're acting as carbon sinks, as Benjamin already implicated or mentioned. The ocean around about 70 ppm, the land around about 89 to 90 ppm. And I'm going to concentrate very much on the land processes here. But what's also something worthwhile considering, this uptake of CO2 from land and ocean processes substantially slows global warming. So at the moment we are at a global mean temperature around about 1 degree above the 1870 pre-industrial level. If those things wouldn't have happened, if we were now at 600 ppm, we would have around about 2 to 2.5 degree global warming above the pre-industrial level. So quite a substantial contribution to slowing warming from those land and ocean processes. So look at the land a little bit in more detail. So what drives this land sink actually? And many of you will know this, but I just thought I'd remind ourselves what's actually going on. First of all, vegetation plants, they're fixing CO2 in a process called photosynthesis, taking up CO2 that way. And that is on a global total per year, approximately 120 gigatons. A gigaton is 10 to the 12 tons, in case you're interested. It's a large amount. Of these 120 gigatons of CO2 that are taken up by photosynthesis, plants are also respiring because they're they're growing, they're providing their own energy. So approximately half of that, approximately 60 gigatons of CO2 get immediately back into the atmosphere through natural processes, through plant growth. Plants also die, and they return to the soil. They decompose in soil, and that also is a process that releases more carbon back into the atmosphere, around about 50 gigatons carbon per year. This is just a proximate kind of number. So after respiration and after decomposition, there's around about 10 gigatons carbon in the system left. But that's not the end of it. So of these 10 gigatons, there's also other processes going on, like fires, disturbances, insect attacks. They're also, again, releasing carbon back in the atmosphere. So what remains, actually, after all those natural processes is a sink of around about 1 to 2 gigatons carbon per year at the moment, which, if you sum it up, over 150 years, contributes substantially to slowing down climate warming because it reduces the anthropogenic CO2 emissions into the atmosphere. What's going on there? And again, sort of very simplistically, why is this thing actually happening? Because you could say if everything was in equilibrium, this actually wouldn't take place. But what's happening is various processes contributing to this sink. First of all, CO2 concentration. So CO2 concentration actually fertilizes photosynthesis. So the more CO2 you give to a plant, the better it grows. So in a sense, if we're enhancing CO2 concentration, it's actually good for plants. They grow better. Climate change has taken place, and climate change takes place in many regions in very diverse ways. Some regions get wetter, some regions get drier, some regions get very warm, like the northern high latitudes, where we actually by now already have a warming of around about 4 to 5 degrees centigrades annually. So these climate change impacts on the carbon sink, they're actually highly unknown, and they're very, very diverse depending on which region you're looking at. And then as a third point, there's of course we humans. And again, the human processes are actually quite diverse because on the one hand, we're deforesting, as we've heard already, and as all of you know probably much more about it, at least in tropical regions than I do. And this deforestation, of course, that reduces the carbon sink because you take plants away and you're emitting CO2 into the atmosphere. But we're also, in some parts of the world at least, we're regrowing actually forests. And this regrowth of forests, fixes carbons. So again, depending on where you are in the globe, where you're looking at, the human contribution to the carbon sink can actually be positive or negative. And sort of, getting these sort of, three main components right when we want to look not only at understanding the sink in the present day, but also want to look into the future, is actually very, very tricky. And I'm going to show you a couple of examples why it's actually very difficult to project that into the future. But let's stick with the present day. So what you're seeing here is one component of the carbon sink. It's not the entire story, it's just one component of it. It's a story where we looked at remotely sensed greenness of vegetation, the sort of amount of leaf area per ground area. And what you're actually seeing here, so there's a map for remote sensing information over 1982 to 2011. And it's actually a little bit, the colors are a little bit not so easy to understand because it's actually the purple and the pink areas that are most green. So, that's not my fault. But anyway, but what you're actually basically seeing is that everything, that is green, blue, pink or purple, the greenness has actually increased over that period. And you see, of course, the tropics, I'm not sure if you can see here, the tropics, they are the ones that sort of, have a very strong positive trend actually in greening. And you might say, why is that? Because there's deforestation going on. But obviously, and I go that in the next slide to that, other processes seen from satellite, I have to say, outweighing basically the deforestation. There's also quite a bit of greening going on, as you can see, in the boreal and temperate zone. And going to the next slide, we actually tried to also attribute to the main factors of what you can see in remote sensing and satellites. And I'm concentrating only on two of them, namely the impact of CO2 concentration and the impact of climate change. And this attribution, sort of, going from this observed greening to sort of, trying to indicate which areas are actually affected mostly by CO2 and mostly by climate change. This is now a model-based analysis that went in between those two pictures. And just very briefly, as you can see here in the northern high latitudes, it is mostly this orange sort of, climate change effect that drives this greening, this growth of vegetation. And again, this is because the northern high latitudes, they're warming so much more rapidly than other parts of the globe. Therefore, we can only attribute that cleaning to climate change. Whereas here in the tropical region, sort of, of South America, of Africa, maybe not so much obvious in Asia, at least according to our models, it's mostly the CO2 fertilization of photosynthesis that drives this observed greening. But how is it going to look like in future? Is that carbon sink or is that greening going to continue? And what you're seeing here is just one example of many studies I could put forward where we projected historically until 2100 with one ecosystem model that was driven by different climate models. Benjamin showed examples of 6 different climate models in his presentations. I think here those different colored lines, there are 18 different climate models. They're all driven by the same sort of, future CO2 scenario. And you see immediately the large uncertainty that we're having in terms of the carbon uptake continuing if we're driving that ecosystem model with some climate models, whereas in other simulations down here, which are marked here in orange, the carbon uptake is actually going to stabilize or even decline, which is bad news for climate change, because if the land doesn't in future take up as much carbon as it did, climate change is going to accelerate. But there's large uncertainty in there, and we're sort of course, working towards trying to reduce these, but we really don't, at this point in time, actually know what's going to happen with the land sink in future. But looking a little bit beyond carbon and coming back to an aspect that, of course, is hugely relevant also to Colombia, what's going to happen with biodiversity in the future? And here, too, this is just one example of a simulation study out of many, many that I could put out here as an example. And this is just really only climate change now. So people have looked at the change in number of species of vertebrate animals in this particular example, between basically today or 1995 and 2080, and they looked at two climate change scenarios. The one up here, top left, is a low degree of warming scenario, around about 2 degrees centigrade in 2100 compared to the pre-industrial. This is a high degree warming scenario. And everything that goes yellow, red, actually is a loss of species as climate warms, because the range of species basically contracts in, according to those models. And you see that in both scenarios, the patterns are actually very, very similar. And already at low warming, we actually find in those model experiments, a large loss of species, particularly in the tropical regions. There's a bit of an increase in the high northern latitude, again, because the species range actually gets bigger as it gets warming in those regions. But for the tropics, the projected species loss due to climate change alone is actually very, very large, already at very low, relatively low climate change projections in terms of warming. So just to summarize the first part of my talk before I go to the second one. So the message I would like to tell you is that the future land sink, the contribution of the land sink to the regulation of atmospheric CO2 concentration is basically unknown. And we need to get better at that as scientists in order to help also policymakers to get an understanding how climate change will develop. But it's also very, very clear that in addition to carbon cycle, there will be many quite diverse impacts of climate change on, for instance, biodiversity, and many other ecosystem services beyond climate that I can't talk about it because I don't have the time. Water regulation, crop yields, we'll talk about that a little bit as well. So anything that we get from the land will be impacted by climate change. The impact can be sometimes positive, sometimes negative, but we need to make sure that we are understanding those multiple impacts in order also to make policy decision making. Okay, so this was the the first part I wanted to introduce, but what about the land use change? I haven't really talked about this yet, and it's also leading on to Mark's presentation later. Coming back to the slide that I showed you before, and remind you that there were about 88 ppm CO2 in the atmosphere emitted cumulatively over 150 years, mostly due to reforestation. So, the question, of course, arises, can we actually, first of all, we need to, first of all, stop deforestation in order to, resolve that CO2 source to the atmosphere, that's for sure. But can we actually also help with bringing the CO2 concentration down by, for instance, reforesting? Can we, replant forests in order to take up CO2? And this is where it becomes a little bit complicated, and I try to introduce you to this graph a little bit. Mark will be showing it again, but what you're seeing here now is the CO2 emissions that are projected for the future from 2020 or whatever to 2100 as big, thick lines here. And there are different trajectories of CO2 emissions into the future. We don't know what the CO2 concentration or emissions are going to be like over the next 10, 15, 20, 100 years. So we are exploring different emission pathway trajectories in order to get an understanding what it actually means for climate change and other processes. So just as one example, if we're taking that upper line here, that would bring CO2 emissions up to 140 gigatons of CO2 from what it is round about now, which is 24, 25. And that would actually correspond to a warming of around about 4 to 5 degrees centigrade. Whereas other emission trajectories, for instance, that sort of purple down here, actually do correspond more with the Paris Agreement of around about 2 degrees centigrade. But what is actually striking in those trajectories is that all those emission scenarios that go down to 2 to 3 degrees centigrade at the end of the century rely on what's called net negative global emissions, which is a horrible term. A negative emission is a horrible term. But they are relying that we're not only stopping emissions, but we're actually removing CO2 from the atmosphere. And the way to achieve these in those models that underpin those scenarios is actually with a very large contribution from land. It is growing bioenergy crops in terms of providing us with energy, but then also with what's called carbon capture storage. So you grow the crops, you combust them to create energy, and during the combustion process, you're actually capturing the CO2 and you put it underground so it doesn't get back released into the atmosphere. And the other aspect is what I've already mentioned is, what happens actually if we're assuming forest regrowth to also help us taking up CO2 from the atmosphere. And this is how the world looks like in some of those scenarios of bioenergy and forest regrowth. So this is a map, again, from, in 2100, where the model has tried to achieve a 2-degree warming world by growing bioenergy crops or by large-scale reforestation together with avoided further deforestation. Up here, we have sort of, all those brown areas, and these brown areas indicate expansion of agriculture, and this agriculture is mostly bioenergy crops. Maize, miscanthus, switchgrass, these sort of types of crops that would be grown in the model. In total, we have about 698 million hectare more cropland compared to today. And just to remind ourselves, the cropland area that we have today is 1,650 million hectares. So we kind of, in those scenarios, you're actually expanding the global cropland area by around about 50%. It's a massive change. But also in terms of those reforestation scenarios, we're actually shrinking the agricultural area by around about 370 million hectares, replacing it with reforested areas. The question, of course, remains, what does it actually do with our food systems? And Mark will tell more about the food anyway. But sticking with the carbon, how realistic are those scenarios of large-scale bioenergy and large-scale reforestation? And again, we're using those maps that I've just shown you in carbon cycle models and look how the carbon cycle responds to these land use changes. And not so surprisingly, in those straight lines here, which is the reforestation scenario, the vegetation carbon pool, of course, continues to increase because you're planting more forests, which are taking out carbon. It's very different, actually, in the bioenergy crop scenarios, which are the dotted line here. And because those bioenergy crop areas, they're actually, creeping into natural, in parts forested land, actually the carbon cycle of the vegetation declines because you're replacing, very simplistically, highly dense carbon forested areas with bioenergy areas. And that reduces your vegetation carbon, which is not good. That's not what you want. But also what we really need to look at is actually the total carbon response of the system. But here too, if you're looking at the dotted lines here, so this is the total carbon pool change over the 21st century. If you look at the dotted lines here, which is the bioenergy scenarios, it takes quite a long time. It takes 20, 30 years before the the carbon actually uptake is actually visible in those forests, and the carbon uptake is actually not particularly strong. So just to summarize that, so the total carbon is a large lag. So there's large uncertainty in a sense in terms of whether those bioenergy and even the reforestation scenarios actually are going to operate at the scale that the models tell us they need to operate in terms of mitigating climate change. Okay, so the overall carbon gain is highly uncertain. But again, we need to consider not only the carbon cycle, we need to look at biodiversity aspects, we need to look at the water pollution aspects, because cropland areas get fertilized. The more cropland areas we're having, the more nitrogen might actually be polluting our waterways. There's N2O emissions from fertilizer, which is a greenhouse gas. There's agricultural water consumption, which is also very important. And I'm just going to show you one example here about a simulated bioenergy scenario and the impact it has on agricultural water use. So what you're seeing here is the starting point present day, about 2,700, 3,000 cubic kilometers per year of water in agricultural areas, which is, if I remember correctly, around about 70 to 75% of the total sweet water use by humans is actually for agricultural. And people have looked at two scenarios. The gray one, which is called BERF, is bioenergy rain-fed. So they're growing bioenergy, aiming for 300 exajoules in the year 2000, compared to around about 50 to 65 exajoules from bioenergy that we have now. So it's quite a substantial change. But they say, okay, we're growing those crops, but we only allow them to be rain-fed, no irrigation. In the red scenario, which is only called bioenergy, the model is also allowed to irrigate those cropland areas, depending on some economic assumptions that are behind those models. And you see immediately the sort of the trade-off that's actually happening. So in the red scenario, you're ending up needing 590 additional million hectares to grow these bioenergy to deliver the target. But you're basically doubling today's sweet water use in order to do that. Whereas if you say, no, we don't want to have any larger water consumption for these bioenergy crops, you can achieve that, but you need much more land. You need 690 million hectares of land. So huge trade-offs, just one example, huge trade-offs that we need to consider when we're looking at large-scale climate change mitigation through land. And that's the last example, again, coming back to biodiversity, which is actually the same study that I showed you before with the global map of total vertebrate loss induced by climate change. And in this figure now, it's actually split into the classes of the amphibians, the birds, and the mammals. And people looked not only on climate change, but also on land use change, specifically, again, under a bioenergy growth scenario. Don't get too confused about this colorful bubble up here. The important thing is the areas where biodiversity is negatively impacted by climate change are the ones that are red, and the ones that are yellow are the ones that are impacted by BC bioenergy crops, land use change. And again, here we have the low warming scenario, and here we have the high warming scenario on the right. On the right-hand side, you see lots of areas that are red, i.e. climate change will be the main driver of biodiversity loss. In the left-hand scenario, we are trying to mitigate climate change to around about 2 degrees centigrade. You see quite large areas being yellow. And that is sort of, where biodiversity will be lost through the expansion of the bioenergy crops that need to be grown to mitigate climate change in these scenarios. So to summarize now, the second part of my talk is, land ecosystem can indeed contribute to climate change mitigation, i.e. avoid deforestation, or maybe also avoid N2O losses, for instance, from too much fertilizer use. But if we want to reduce mean global temperature, or the warming rate that we're seeing, with really large-scale bioenergy plantations, or even large-scale afforestation, this is going to be having very, very large trade-offs. So on the one hand, we want to reduce climate change in order to avoid negative impacts on biodiversity and many other ecosystem services. But if we want to get there with the land only, with very large-scale mitigation efforts, we're also actually creating additional issues for biodiversity and many other ecosystem services. So that is actually a real lose-lose situation that I'm telling you now. But so what can we do? we need to reduce our fossil fuel emissions now, and we need to do it rapidly, and we need to sort of really concentrate on these aspects. Thank you.